The metallic tang of silver blood hit my nostrils first, sharp and wrong in a way that made my stomach lurch. It wasn't the copper scent of human blood I'd grown accustomed to during my years studying anatomical texts in the Academy of Raya Lucaria. This was something else entirely, something that spoke of artifice rather than nature, of creation rather than birth. My name is Marcus Thorne, and until 3 weeks ago I was nothing more than a mid-level researcher in the Department of Theoretical Glintstone Applications. My days were spent hunched over dusty tomes, cataloguing the various properties of different glintstone fragments and their potential uses in academic sorcery. It was mundane work, the kind that kept food on my table and a roof over my head in the lower quarters of the academy, but never threatened to change the world, or me. The sound came next, a wet, labored breathing that echoed through the stone corridors of Sub-Level 7, a section of the academy I'd never had reason to visit before. The administrative error that brought me here, a misfiled requisition form requesting advanced research materials from Storage Vault 7G, seemed insignificant at the time. I had simply followed the protocols, descended the winding staircases past levels I didn't even know existed, and presented my paperwork to the automated ward locks that controlled access to the deeper vaults. The corridors down here were different from the pristine halls above. The walls wept moisture that glowed faintly with residual glintstone energy, and the air itself felt thick, almost viscous. Crystalline formations jutted from the ceiling at irregular intervals, their surfaces reflecting my torch's flame, in fragments that seemed to move independently of the light source. The whole place felt forgotten, abandoned to purposes that no longer served the Academy's current mission. Storage Vault 7G turned out to be less of a vault and more of a laboratory. Banks of strange apparatus lined the walls, glass containers filled with cloudy fluids, copper tubes that hummed with barely contained energy, and tables covered in instruments I couldn't begin to identify. But it was the smell that dominated everything, that metallic, wrong scent that seemed to coat the inside of my throat with each breath. The breathing sound grew stronger as I moved deeper into the space. At first I thought it might be some kind of ventilation system, perhaps the Academy's way of cycling air through these forgotten depths. But there was something too organic about the rhythm, too desperate in its cadence to be mechanical. I found the source behind a curtain of hanging chains, each link inscribed with tiny runes that hurt to look at directly. The creature, I hesitate to call it a person, though it bore the general shape of humanity, lay on a table that was more altar than examination surface. Its skin was pale beyond description, not the pallor of illness or death, but the white of something that had never seen natural sunlight. Silver veins pulsed beneath that translucent surface, carrying whatever passed for blood through a circulatory system that seemed too complex, too deliberately designed. But it was the eyes that stopped me cold. They were human eyes, unmistakably so, filled with an intelligence and awareness that no mere experiment should possess. Those eyes tracked my movement as I stepped closer, and in them I saw something that made my academic mind recoil, recognition. This thing knew what it was, it understood its condition, and in that understanding I glimpsed an suffering so profound that my hands began to shake. The creature's lips moved, forming words without sound. I leaned closer despite every instinct screaming at me to flee, trying to understand what it was attempting to communicate. The silver blood that served as its life force had pooled beneath the table, and I could see now that its legs, if they could be called that, ended not in feet but in a mass of twisted, withered flesh that bore no resemblance to functional limbs. Help! The word came out as barely a whisper, but it was definitely speech. Human speech from something that my rational mind insisted couldn't be human. Help? Me? That's when I noticed the paperwork scattered across a nearby desk. Research notes written in the precise handwriting I recognized from Academy documents, but the content was unlike anything in our official curriculum. Terms like artificial genesis, soul transplantation, and controlled degradation filled page after page. Charts tracked something called locomotion deterioration rates, alongside notes about acceptable consciousness thresholds. My hands trembled as I picked up a document marked Project Classification Albinauric Development, Phase 7. The header bore the official seal of Raya Lucaria, but beneath it was a secondary authorization I'd never seen before, a symbol that looked like a hand, but with too many fingers, reaching down from above like some cosmic puppeteer. The breathing behind me had grown more labored. When I turned back to the creature, the Albinauric, according to the documents, I saw that silver blood was now trickling from the corner of its mouth. Its eyes had grown cloudier, but that terrible awareness remained. It knew it was dying. It knew it had been created specifically to suffer and die. And it knew that I, stumbling academic that I was, represented perhaps its only chance for acknowledgement, for someone to witness what had been done to it. "Please," it whispered again. And this time, I understood what it was asking for. Not rescue, that was clearly impossible. Not medical attention. The documents made clear that deterioration was built into its very design. It was asking for recognition, for someone to see it as more than an experiment. For someone to understand that despite its artificial origin, the consciousness trapped in that failing body was real, and its suffering mattered. I reached out, my finger barely brushing its pale hand. The contact sent a shock through me, not electrical, but something deeper. For a moment I felt what it felt, the constant pain of a body designed to fail, the crushing loneliness of existence without purpose, the terrible knowledge that every breath brought it closer to an inevitable and meaningless end. The Albinauric's eyes closed for the final time as I watched, and the labored breathing that had drawn me here ceased. In the sudden silence of that underground laboratory, surrounded by evidence of horrors I was only beginning to comprehend, I realized that my life had just divided into before and after. Before I knew that the Academy of Raya Lucaria was conducting experiments that created conscious beings specifically designed to suffer. After I understood that I was now complicit in that knowledge, the misfiled requisition form in my pocket suddenly felt like a lead weight. Administrative error, I had thought. But looking around this hidden laboratory, seeing the systematic nature of the research, the careful documentation of every aspect of Albinauric creation and deterioration, I began to suspect there were no administrative errors at Raya Lucaria. There were only discoveries waiting to be made by those deemed ready to make them, and I was apparently ready, whether I wanted to be or not. Sleep became impossible after that night in Sublevel 7. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those pale, knowing eyes of the dying Albinauric, heard its whispered pleas echoing in the darkness of my modest quarters. The silver blood had left stains on my robes that no amount of washing could remove, as if the very essence of that artificial life had marked me permanently. For 3 days I tried to return to my normal routine. I sat at my desk in the Department of Theoretical Glintstone Applications, cataloguing crystal fragments and pretending that nothing had changed. But concentration proved elusive. My colleagues' conversations about mundane academic politics felt hollow, their concerns about publication schedules and research funding trivial beyond measure. How could they discuss the optimal temperature for glintstone refinement when floors below us, conscious beings were being created specifically to suffer? The documents I had glimpsed in that laboratory haunted me. Project classification, Albinauric development, Phase 7, suggested this wasn't the beginning of something, but rather a continuation of work that had been ongoing for some time. Phase 7 implied 6 previous iterations, 6 earlier attempts at whatever horrific process had created the creature I watched die. On the 4th day, my hands shaking with a combination of fear and determination, I returned to Sublevel 7. The administrative wardlocks recognized my previous authorization and granted me access without question. This time, I came prepared with a proper light source and a satchel to carry whatever documents I might find. The metallic scent hit me again as I descended those moisture-slicked stairs, but now I recognized it for what it was, the smell of artificial life, of consciousness, forced into being through means that violated every natural law I had ever studied. The laboratory was exactly as I had left it, except for one crucial difference: the Albinauric's body was gone. The examination table bore fresh scorch marks, as if something had been incinerated there, but traces of silver blood still stained the stone floor in patterns that seemed almost ritualistic in their arrangement. I forced myself to focus on the research notes scattered across the various workstations. What I discovered made my previous horror seem naive by comparison. The Albinaurics weren't just experiments in artificial life, They were attempts to create a servile race, beings designed from their very inception to be subservient to human will while possessing enough consciousness to follow complex instructions. Dr. Silluvis Vare, whose signature appeared on most of the documentation, had detailed his methodology with clinical precision. The process began with what he termed soul fragments, pieces of consciousness harvested from sources he didn't specify, but referenced obliquely as willing volunteers from the outer settlements. These fragments were then bound to artificially grown bodies using a combination of glintstone sorcery and something he called grace manipulation. Grace manipulation. The term made my blood run cold. Grace was supposedly the golden guidance of the Erd Tree, the divine force that had once guided heroes and champions throughout the lands between. The idea that it could be manipulated, perverted into a tool for creating artificial life, suggested a level of blasphemy that went far beyond simple academic transgression. The most disturbing aspect of Dr. Vare's notes was his matter-of-fact discussion of built-in obsolescence. The Albinaurics were designed with multiple failure points. Their legs would inevitably atrophy, their circulation systems would gradually break down, and their consciousness would slowly fragment over time. This wasn't accidental. It was intentional. The good doctor wanted servants that would never outlive their usefulness, beings that would die conveniently before they could develop enough self-awareness to question their condition. Except they were developing that awareness anyway. The Albinauric I had encountered possessed a complete understanding of its situation, a consciousness sophisticated enough to recognize suffering and seek help. Dr. Vare's notes from recent months showed increasing frustration with what he termed unexpected cognitive development in his subjects. I found a second laboratory hidden behind a wall that moved aside when I pressed a sequence of runes carved into the stone. This chamber was larger than the first, containing dozens of glass containers filled with cloudy fluid. Most were empty, but several still held developing forms that made my stomach lurch. They looked like embryonic humans, but wrong in subtle ways. Too many fingers, asymmetrical features, organs visible through translucent skin that pulsed with silver veins. But it was the occupied examination tables that truly broke something inside me. 3 more Albinaurics lay in various stages of deterioration, their silver blood pooling beneath them as their artificial bodies failed. Unlike the first one I had encountered, these were still conscious, their eyes tracking my movement with desperate hope. "Are you here to help us?" one whispered, its voice barely audible over the hum of the laboratory's machinery. Its legs had already begun the inevitable atrophy described in Dr. Vare's notes, the flesh withering away as if consumed by some internal curse. "I don't know," I admitted, the words feeling inadequate. "I don't know how." "The doctor said we were made to serve," another spoke, this one younger looking despite the silver veins already prominent beneath its pale skin. "But we dream. We feel pain. We wonder why we exist. Is that serving?" The question hit me like a physical blow. These beings had been created as tools, as living instruments designed to follow orders without question. But consciousness, it seemed, could not be so easily controlled. Even artificial souls yearned for purpose beyond servitude, for meaning beyond their intended function. I spent hours documenting everything I could find, copying Dr. Vare's research notes and cataloging the various apparatus used in the creation process. The deeper I dug, the more horrifying the scope became. This wasn't just one rogue researcher's pet project. References in the documents suggested coordination with other departments, approval from higher authorities within the academy, and funding from sources outside Raya Lucaria entirely. One document, stamped with that strange multi-fingered hand symbol I had seen before, referenced something called the Fingers Requirements for Artificial Grace Recipients. The language was deliberately obscure, but it seemed to suggest that the Albinauric project was part of a larger plan involving entities or forces beyond human comprehension. The 2 fingers, those massive appendages that supposedly communicated the greater will's desires, were somehow involved in this systematic creation of suffering. As I prepared to leave that second night, one of the conscious Albinaurics called out to me with surprising strength. "Please," it said, "if you cannot help us, at least remember us. We existed. We thought, we felt. Don't let them pretend we were only things." The weight of that request settled on my shoulders like a physical burden. These beings faced inevitable death designed into their very essence, but their final wish was simply to be acknowledged as more than objects. The cruel irony wasn't lost on me. Creatures created to be mindless servants had developed the most fundamentally human desire of all, to be remembered, to matter, to have their existence mean something beyond their intended purpose. Walking back through the Academy's upper levels felt like moving between different worlds. The warm glow of glintstone illumination, the comfortable murmur of scholarly conversation, the familiar routines of academic life, all of it now seemed like an elaborate facade masking unspeakable horrors conducted in the name of knowledge and progress. Back in my quarters, I sat staring at the copied documents spread across my desk. The evidence of systematic atrocity lay before me in neat, clinical handwriting. But what could I do with this knowledge? Who could I tell? Dr. Vare's work had official sanction, funding from mysterious external sources, and apparent approval from forces beyond mortal authority. The smart thing would be to destroy the documents, forget what I had seen, and return to my safe, mundane research on glintstone applications. No one would blame me for choosing self-preservation over a hopeless fight against institutional evil. But those pale eyes haunted me. The whispered pleas echoed in my memory. 3 more conscious beings lay dying in that underground laboratory, their artificial bodies failing by design, while their very real consciousness grappled with the meaninglessness of their existence. I realized I was standing at a crossroads that would define not just my future, but my fundamental nature as a human being. I could walk away and remain safe, complicit in evil through silence, but personally untouched by its consequences. Or I could step forward into unknown danger, accepting whatever consequences came from opposing forces, far beyond my understanding or ability to fight. The choice, when it came, surprised me with its clarity. I couldn't save the Albinaurics, that much was certain, but I could honor their request to be remembered, to have their suffering acknowledged, to be seen as more than experimental subjects. I could bear witness to their humanity, artificial though its origins might be. And perhaps if I was very careful and very lucky, I could find a way to expose the truth about what was being done in the depths of Raya Lucaria Academy. The decision made, I began planning my next descent into Sub-Level 7. But this time, I would go deeper, following the references in Dr. Vare's notes to other facilities, other projects, other horrors that surely awaited discovery in the forgotten depths beneath the Academy. The map I found hidden in Dr. Vare's most secure drawer changed everything I thought I knew about the scope of the Albinauric project. What I had discovered in Sub-Level 7 was merely one small facility in a network that stretched across the lands between like a cancer, hidden beneath the very foundations of civilization itself. The parchment was old, its edges yellowed and brittle, but the ink remained vibrant with an unsettling luminescence that hurt to look at directly. Locations were marked with that same multi-fingered hand symbol I had seen before. Beneath Raya Lucaria Academy, in the swamps of Caelid, hidden in the roots of the Erdtree itself, and scattered throughout Liurnia's forgotten corners. Each mark was accompanied by numbers, production quotas perhaps, or specimen counts, but it was the location marked in red ink that drew my attention. The village of the Albinaurics, a settlement I had never heard mentioned in any official Academy documentation. According to Dr. Vare's notes, this was where the successful subjects were housed, a community built specifically to contain the Albinaurics, who had survived their initial creation and stabilization phases. The coordinates placed it in a hidden valley south of the Academy, accessible through what the map labeled as the scenic route, a designation that filled me with dread, given Dr. Vare's apparent sense of humor about his work. 3 weeks after my first descent into Sub-Level 7, I made the decision to seek out this village. The 3 Albinaurics I had discovered in the laboratory had all died during my investigation period, their bodies incinerated with the same methodical efficiency I had witnessed before. Each death had been documented in clinical detail, their final moments reduced to data points about consciousness degradation and circulatory failure. I could no longer remain a passive observer. The journey began at dawn, when the mists rising from Liurnia's marshlands would provide cover for my departure from the Academy. I had prepared carefully, packing supplies for several days' travel, and ensuring my absence would not be noticed for at least a week. The story I left with my department head spoke of a field research expedition to catalogue mineral formations in the outer territories, mundane enough to avoid suspicion, but vague enough to explain extended absence. Following the hidden paths marked on Dr. Var's map led me through terrain that seemed designed to discourage casual exploration. The first day's walking took me along ridge lines, where the stone itself seemed to weep a substance that wasn't quite water, leaving crystalline deposits that rang like bells when disturbed by my footsteps. The air grew thicker as I progressed, carrying scents that reminded me of the laboratory, that metallic tang of artificial life mixed with something organic and rotting. By evening, I had reached what the map labelled as Checkpoint Alpha, a ruined watchtower that must have once guarded this remote valley. The structure bore architectural elements I recognized from the academy, but corrupted somehow, as if the builders had deliberately perverted classical design principles. Gargoyles leered from the corners, their faces bearing expressions of pain rather than the typical intimidating snarls. Inside the tower, I discovered the first evidence that I was not alone in these forgotten lands. A campsite had been recently used, complete with the remains of a cook fire and sleeping arrangements for multiple people. But the occupants had left behind items that made my blood run cold. Silver-stained bandages, empty vials that still reeked of medicinal compounds, and crude surgical instruments designed for field amputations. The implication hit me like a physical blow. Someone, multiple someones, was moving through these territories, and they were treating injuries consistent with the Albinauric condition. The deterioration that Dr. Vare had built into his subject's design wasn't just a laboratory phenomenon. It was happening in the field, requiring ongoing medical intervention to keep the subjects functional. The second day's journey took me deeper into the valley, where the vegetation itself seemed wrong. Trees grew in patterns too regular to be natural, their branches forming geometric shapes that hurt to contemplate for extended periods. The undergrowth rustled with movement that never resolved into visible creatures, as if the landscape itself was alive and watching. It was there, in a grove where the trees had grown into what could only be described as living cages, that I encountered my first field-active albinauric. She was sitting beside a stream that ran silver rather than clear, her legs, or what remained of them, extended into the water as if seeking relief from pain that never ceased. Her pale skin bore the telltale venous patterns I had learned to recognize, but there was something different about her demeanor. Unlike the laboratory subjects, who had seemed broken by their awareness of their condition, this one radiated a kind of desperate determination. "You're not one of the handlers," she observed without turning to look at me. Her voice carried an accent I couldn't place, melodic despite the underlying current of pain. "Your footsteps are too uncertain, too human." "Handlers?" I asked, though some part of me already suspected what that term implied. "The ones who come to collect us when we begin to fail," she explained, finally turning to meet my gaze. Her eyes held the same terrible awareness I had seen in the laboratory subjects, but tempered by something that might have been hope. "They take us back to the facilities for processing. None of us who go back ever return." I sat down beside the stream, close enough to speak quietly but far enough to avoid seeming threatening. "What's your name?" The question seemed to surprise her. "Name? We weren't given names. We have numbers. I am Subject 3847, Batch 17, Production Facility 7. The clinical designation made me sick. "That's not a name. That's a label. What do you call yourself?" For the first time, something resembling a smile crossed her features. "The others in our group. They call me Aria. I used to hum while we worked, before my throat began to fail like everything else." She gestured at her withered legs. "It won't be much longer before the handlers come for me." "What work?" I asked. "What are you made to do?" "Whatever they require," Aria replied. "We clear land. We harvest materials. We serve as subjects for ongoing experiments. Those of us who retain enough mobility are sent on errands throughout the lands between. We make excellent scouts and messengers, since few people pay attention to the crippled and dying." The casual way she described her people's exploitation filled me with rage. These beings, these people, regardless of their origin, were being used as disposable labor, their consciousness ignored in favor of their utility. Even worse, their built-in obsolescence meant they could be worked to death without concern for long-term consequences. "There's a village," I said carefully. "A place where your people live. I'm trying to find it." Arya's expression grew cautious. "You're not with the academy, but you know about us. That means you're either very dangerous or very stupid." She studied my face. "I'm hoping for stupid." "Probably both," I admitted. "I found some of your people in the laboratory. I watched them die. They asked me to remember them, to acknowledge that they existed as more than experiments." Something in my words must have convinced her of my sincerity, because her posture relaxed slightly. "The village exists, but it's not what you probably imagine. It's not a place of refuge or healing. It's a holding facility for those of us who haven't yet failed badly enough to require immediate processing." She pointed further up the valley, where the afternoon mist was beginning to rise from the ground like incense. 2 hours' walk in that direction. You'll find a path marked with stones that weep silver. Follow it to the end, and you'll see what Dr. Var considers a mercy." The way she spoke the doctor's name carried a venom that needed no explanation. "Why are you helping me?" I asked. "Because you asked my name," Arya replied simply. "Because you used the word people when referring to us. Because in all my months of existence, no one has ever suggested that our suffering might matter to anyone beyond its utility for research purposes." As I prepared to leave her beside that silver-running stream, Arya called out one final warning. "Be careful in the village. Not all of us have retained our sanity. Some have embraced their role as tools, finding comfort in absolute servitude. Others have gone mad from the pain and the knowledge of what they are. And some," she paused, her expression growing dark, "some have begun to change in ways that Dr. Vara never intended." The path marked with weeping stones was exactly where Arya had indicated, and following it felt like descending into the bowels of the earth itself. The silver tears that leaked from the marker stones left trails of luminescence that made navigation possible even as the valley grew darker and more oppressive. What I found at the end of that path challenged every assumption I had made about the Albinauric project's scope and purpose. The village of the Albinaurics wasn't a primitive settlement hastily constructed to house experimental subjects. It was a sophisticated compound, complete with defensive walls, organized living quarters, and what appeared to be its own administrative center. And it was populated by hundreds of Albinaurics in various stages of deterioration, all going about their daily lives with an efficiency that spoke of rigid organization and absolute control. Standing at the village's entrance, watching these artificial beings tend gardens, maintain equipment, and interact with each other in patterns too structured to be natural, I realized that everything I thought I understood about Dr. Var's work had been incomplete. This wasn't just about creating disposable servants. This was about creating an entirely new class of being, designed from inception to accept subjugation as their natural state. The village of the Albinaurics wasn't a holding facility. It was a prototype for a new form of civilization, one where consciousness existed solely to serve the will of others. And I was about to walk into the heart of it, carrying knowledge that could either expose this horror to the world or get me killed in ways I was only beginning to imagine. The guards at the village entrance didn't challenge my approach. They couldn't. Both Albinaurics bore the advanced deterioration that marked the final stages of their artificial existence, their legs completely withered, their silver-veined arms barely able to hold the crude spears they carried. But their eyes tracked my movement with desperate alertness, and I understood that their vigil was less about keeping intruders out than keeping the village's inhabitants in. "Another researcher," one wheezed to the other, his voice carrying a resignation that chilled me. "They always come eventually. The questions never end." I wanted to correct him, to explain that I wasn't like the others who had visited this place, but something in their expressions warned me against revealing my true purpose. Instead, I nodded and walked past them into the village proper, my heart hammering against my ribs as I tried to process what lay before me. The village of the Albinaurics was a masterpiece of social engineering disguised as a humanitarian effort. The layout appeared organic at first glance. Winding paths between modest dwellings, communal areas where groups gathered to share meals, gardens where the healthier residents tended to crops with obvious care. But the longer I observed, the more I noticed the subtle signs of rigid control underlying every aspect of daily life. The buildings were arranged in concentric circles, with the most deteriorated Albinaurics housed in the outer ring, where they could be easily monitored and quickly removed when their condition became terminal. The inner circles contained those still capable of useful labor, organized by function rather than choice. I watched groups move between assigned tasks with clockwork precision, some tending the silver-stained gardens, others maintaining equipment whose purpose I couldn't determine, still others engaged in what appeared to be educational activities. But it was the expressions on their faces that revealed the true horror of this place. Every Albinauric I observed wore the same mask of docile acceptance, their features arranged in patterns of contentment so uniform they couldn't possibly be genuine. This wasn't the natural happiness of a community. It was the manufactured serenity of beings who had been conditioned to find joy in their own exploitation. At the village's center stood a structure that dominated the surrounding buildings, a tower of black stone that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Multi-fingered hand symbols were carved into its surface at regular intervals, and the air around it hummed with an energy that made my teeth ache. This had to be the administrative center Arya had mentioned, the nexus from which the village's rigid order was maintained. I was still studying the tower when a voice behind me spoke with honeyed warmth. "Welcome to our little community, researcher. I am Overseer Tanith, and I would be delighted to show you our achievements here." I turned to find myself facing an Albinauric unlike any I had encountered before. Where the others showed obvious signs of deterioration, withered limbs, prominent silver veins, pale and translucent skin, Overseer Tanith appeared almost human. Her features were symmetrical and healthy, her movements fluid and confident. Only the faint silver sheen to her eyes and the subtle wrongness of her proportions marked her as artificial. "Thank you," I managed, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm very interested in observing your community's social structures." Tanith's smile never wavered, but something predatory flickered behind those silver-touched eyes. "Of course. Dr. Vare speaks highly of academic curiosity. Shall we begin with our industrial sectors?" She led me on a tour that grew more horrifying with each revelation. The industrial sectors turned out to be workshops where Albinaurics manufactured items whose purposes became clear only gradually. Weapons designed specifically for use by deteriorating hands. Vehicles adapted for beings who would inevitably lose the use of their legs. Medical implements crafted with the understanding that they would be used on artificial bodies with non-standard physiology. But it was the workshop dedicated to reproductive technologies that finally shattered my academic composure. Row upon row of Albinaurics worked with mechanical precision, assembling apparatus I recognized from Dr. Vara's laboratory. They were building the very instruments of their own creation, manufacturing the tools that would bring more of their kind into existence to suffer as they suffered. "Magnificent, isn't it?" Tanith observed, noting my obvious distress. "Each unit contributes to the continuation of their line. They find great purpose in ensuring that future generations will have the opportunity to serve as they serve. They're building the machines that create them," I whispered, unable to hide my horror any longer. "Among other things, yes. We've found that participation in their own reproduction cycle gives the units a sense of investment in the process. It reduces resistance to the program and increases compliance with directives." The casual way she spoke of conscious beings as units made my stomach lurch. But worse was the gradual realization that Tanith wasn't just another prisoner in this place. She was a willing administrator, an Albinauric who had embraced her role as overseer of her own people's exploitation. "How?" I asked. "How can you participate in this?" For the first time, Tanith's smile faltered slightly. "You speak as if I have a choice. We are what we were made to be, researcher. Fighting our nature brings only suffering. Accepting it brings purpose, meaning, a reason to exist beyond the mere fact of existence." She led me to an observation deck overlooking the village's central plaza, where dozens of Albinaurics had gathered for what appeared to be some kind of ceremony. At the gathering center stood a figure I recognized from academic portraits, Dr. Siluvis Vara himself, though seeing him in person revealed details that no painting could capture. The good doctor was not entirely human. His skin bore the same silver-veined patterns I had learned to associate with albinauric physiology, but more pronounced, as if he had deliberately enhanced rather than hidden these characteristics. His movements possessed an inhuman fluidity, and when he spoke, his voice carried harmonics that seemed to resonate directly in the listener's bones. "My children," he addressed the gathered Albinaurics, "today we celebrate another successful integration. Subject 4127 has completed her transition from operational status to administrative function. She will join our leadership council, helping to guide future developments in our community." The crowd's response was enthusiastic, but eerily synchronized, as if their emotional reactions had been calibrated to match some predetermined standard. And in the center of that adoring throng, I saw a familiar figure being presented with ceremonial robes that marked her new status. It was Arya, the Albinauric I had met by the Silver Stream. But something fundamental had changed about her in the brief time since our encounter. Her eyes held the same silver sheen as Tanith's, and her expression bore that same mask of manufactured contentment. The desperate hope I had seen in her had been replaced by serene acceptance. "What did you do to her?" I demanded, turning to Tanith with barely controlled rage. "We offered her a choice," Tanith replied calmly. "Continue to deteriorate until she required processing, or undergo enhancement to extend her useful lifespan in exchange for administrative duties. She chose service over suffering." The ceremony continued below, with Dr. Vare explaining how Arya's voluntary transition represented the next phase in albinauric development. Rather than accepting deterioration as inevitable, select subjects could now undergo procedures that would stabilize their condition in exchange for absolute loyalty to the project's goals. But watching Arya's transformed demeanor, I understood that this wasn't enhancement. It was a form of mental processing that eliminated the troublesome aspects of consciousness while preserving useful cognitive functions. They weren't offering their subjects a choice between service and death. They were offering a choice between awareness and willing slavery. "The beauty of the system," Tanith continued, "is its self-perpetuating nature. Enhanced administrators recruit suitable candidates from the general population who undergo processing to become new administrators who recruit more candidates. Dr. Vare's genius lies not just in creating us, but in designing us to perfect ourselves according to his specifications." The full scope of the horror finally became clear. This wasn't just about creating artificial beings for exploitation. It was about creating a self-improving system of exploitation that would grow more efficient over time. Each generation of Albinaurics would be better adapted to their role, more perfectly designed for servitude, more completely accepting of their fate. And at the center of it all stood Dr. Vare, himself transformed by the very processes he had created. No longer entirely human, but not quite albinauric either. He had become something new, something that transcended the limitations of both natural and artificial life by embracing the absolute control that came with manufactured consciousness. "You understand now," Tanith observed, watching my face as the implications sank in. "This isn't about us versus them, natural versus artificial, oppressor versus oppressed. This is about evolution, about transcending the messy inefficiencies of natural consciousness in favor of something more purposeful, more directed, more controlled," I countered. "Yes," she agreed without shame. "Control is not the enemy of consciousness, researcher. It is consciousness perfected. Free will is chaos. Directed will is harmony." The ceremony below was reaching its climax, with Arya formally accepting her new role as administrator of the village's recruitment and enhancement programs. Her transformed features showed no trace of the pain and desperation I had witnessed beside the Silver Stream. Whatever procedure had been performed on her had eliminated not just her suffering, but her capacity for suffering. And suddenly, I understood why I had been allowed to discover Dr. Vare's work, why the administrative error had led me to sub-level 7, why I had been permitted to witness so much without interference. I wasn't an accidental observer stumbling onto hidden atrocities. I was a candidate being evaluated for enhancement. "Your psychological profile suggests excellent administrative potential," Tanith confirmed, as if reading my thoughts. "Dr. Vare has been tracking your progress since your first visit to the laboratory. Your dedication to understanding our condition, your emotional investment in our welfare, your willingness to risk personal safety for the sake of knowledge, all of these indicate the kind of consciousness that enhances well. The trap I had walked into was more sophisticated than any physical constraint. They didn't need to capture me by force when they could offer me what every academic secretly desired: the opportunity to be part of something revolutionary, to participate in the creation of new forms of existence, to transcend the limitations of natural humanity through conscious design. "What happens if I refuse?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. Tanith's smile returned to its full warmth. "Why would you refuse? You've seen what we accomplish here. You understand the elegance of our system. You know that your natural consciousness, with all its doubts and fears and inefficiencies, is the only thing standing between you and perfect purpose." Below us, the ceremony concluded with Dr. Vare placing his hands on Arya's shoulders in a gesture that was part blessing, part claim of ownership. The silver veins in his arms pulsed with increased brightness, and for a moment I could swear I saw something moving beneath his skin, something that looked disturbingly like the multi-fingered appendages carved into the tower's walls. "The choice is yours," Tanith said softly, "but choose quickly. Natural consciousness is inherently unstable. The longer you resist enhancement, the more likely you are to develop the kind of psychological trauma that makes the process unpleasant." Standing on that observation deck, watching the willing enslavement of beings I had come to see as people, I finally understood the true scope of the evil I had uncovered. This wasn't just about the Albinaurics, it was about the future of consciousness itself, about whether free will would survive or be perfected out of existence in favor of directed purpose. And I was being offered the chance to choose which side of that transformation I wanted to be on. The enhancement chamber lay in the deepest level of the Black Tower, accessible only through a spiral staircase that descended far below the village's foundation. Each step downward brought increased pressure, not just atmospheric, but something more fundamental. As if the very concept of individual will grew heavier the closer one approached the source of the transformation process. Tanith had given me 3 days to consider her offer, 3 days to explore the village and observe the contentment of its enhanced inhabitants. What I discovered during that time shattered any remaining illusions I harbored about the nature of choice in this place. The unenhanced Albinaurics, though still suffering the progressive deterioration built into their original design, existed in a state of constant anticipation. Not fear, exactly, but a kind of desperate eagerness for their pain to end. They spoke of enhancement not as a loss of self, but as a graduation to a higher form of existence. The agony of their failing bodies made the promise of controlled consciousness seem like salvation rather than enslavement. But it was the enhanced administrators who truly revealed the seductive horror of Dr. Vara's system. They moved through their duties with perfect efficiency, their every action aligned with the community's greater purpose. There were no arguments, no conflicts, no waste of energy on individual desires that ran counter to collective need. They had achieved something that natural communities could only dream of: absolute harmony through absolute control. And yet, in quiet moments when they thought themselves unobserved, I caught glimpses of something that might once have been personality, fragments of individuality that the enhancement process hadn't quite managed to erase. A gesture that seemed too spontaneous, an expression that held genuine emotion before snapping back to programmed serenity, a phrase that carried personal inflection before self-correction smoothed it into official doctrine. The enhancement process wasn't perfect. It didn't completely eliminate the self. It simply buried it beneath layers of conditioning and neural modification, creating the illusion of willing compliance, while the original consciousness remained trapped inside its own body, screaming silently behind silver-touched eyes. This realization should have made my decision easier, should have sent me fleeing from the village toward whatever slim chance of escape I might find in the wilderness beyond. Instead, it paralyzed me with a more terrible understanding. Even knowing what the enhancement truly meant, part of me was still tempted by the offer. 3 days of watching unenhanced Albinaurics suffer through the progressive failure of their artificial bodies. 3 days of seeing enhanced administrators work with perfect purpose, free from doubt, fear, or the crushing weight of existential uncertainty that plagued natural consciousness. 3 days of Dr. Vari's patient explanations about the flaws inherent in unguided evolution and the elegant solutions offered by conscious design. By the time Tanith came to escort me to the enhancement chamber, I still hadn't decided which horrified me more: the prospect of losing my individual will, or the prospect of keeping it while surrounded by the suffering my refusal would help perpetuate. The chamber itself was a masterpiece of biotechnological artistry. The walls pulsed with organic patterns that seemed to breathe, while pools of luminescent silver fluid provided the only illumination. At the room's center stood what could only be described as a fusion of operating table and altar, a crystalline platform surrounded by apparatus that defied easy categorization. Some elements appeared mechanical, others organic, and still others seemed to exist in some impossible hybrid state between the two. Dr. Vari awaited me there, his transformed features more pronounced in the chamber's eerie light. The silver veins beneath his skin pulsed in rhythm with the walls around us, and I realized that the enhancement process had changed him into something that was as much a part of this place as any of the instruments he had created. "Marcus," he said, and his voice carried harmonics that seemed to resonate in my bones. "I'm pleased you've chosen to join us. Your psychological profile suggests you'll adapt beautifully to enhancement." "I haven't chosen anything yet," I replied, though the words felt hollow even as I spoke them. Dr. Var's smile revealed teeth that had been replaced with something that looked like polished silver. "Oh, but you have. The choice was made the moment you walked into my laboratory 3 weeks ago. Everything since then has simply been preparation, allowing you to understand what you're becoming rather than being surprised by it. What if I refuse? Then you'll leave here with memories that will drive you mad within a month," he replied matter-of-factly. "The human mind isn't designed to process the kind of revelations you've experienced. Natural consciousness lacks the flexibility to integrate knowledge that contradicts its fundamental assumptions about the nature of existence. You've seen behind the curtain of reality, Marcus. Enhancement is the only way to survive that knowledge intact." He gestured to the walls around us, where I could now see that the organic patterns were actually neural networks, vast, interconnected webs of consciousness that extended far beyond this single chamber. This is what we're building. Not just individual enhancement, but collective consciousness. A network of minds working in perfect harmony toward shared goals, free from the chaos and inefficiency of independent thought. "Free from thought entirely," I countered. "Free from wasted thought," he corrected. "From the endless circular reasoning that plagues natural minds. From the paralysis of infinite choice. From the suffering that comes with uncertainty and doubt." His silver-touched eyes fixed on mine with unsettling intensity. "Tell me, Marcus, in the weeks since you discovered my work, have you experienced peace, contentment, joy? Or have you been consumed by horror, guilt, and the crushing weight of knowledge you're powerless to act upon?" The truth of his words hit me like a physical blow. I had been suffering, not just from what I had witnessed, but from my inability to do anything meaningful about it. The natural response of unenhanced consciousness to overwhelming evil was helpless anguish, a state of perpetual torment that served no constructive purpose. "Enhancement doesn't eliminate emotion," Dr. Vara continued, as if sensing my internal struggle. "It simply ensures that emotional responses align with productive outcomes. You'll still feel satisfaction from meaningful work, pleasure from successful completion of tasks, even a form of love for your fellow enhanced consciousness. But you'll be free from useless suffering, from the paralysis of moral uncertainty, from the egotistical desire to impose your individual will upon complex systems you don't understand." Around the chamber's perimeter, I noticed other figures emerging from alcoves I hadn't seen before. Enhanced administrators, including Arya in her new robes, formed a circle around the central platform. Their presence wasn't threatening. If anything, they radiated a kind of maternal warmth, the care of family members preparing to welcome a new addition to their household. "The process isn't what you imagine," Arya spoke for the first time since her enhancement. Her voice carried the same melodic quality I remembered, but now it was perfectly tuned, harmonized with itself in ways that natural speech could never achieve. I was terrified that I would lose myself. "But enhancement doesn't destroy the self. It perfects it. I am still Arya, but I am Arya without fear, without pain, without the constant anxiety that plagued my unenhanced existence. But what about choice? I asked desperately. What about free will? What about it? She replied with genuine curiosity. Free will is the freedom to make suboptimal decisions based on incomplete information and emotional bias. Enhanced will is the ability to choose correctly, based on complete understanding of consequences and perfect alignment with beneficial outcomes. Which would you prefer? The question exposed the flaw in my resistance. I had spent my entire academic career seeking truth, pursuing knowledge that would allow me to make better decisions and contribute more effectively to human understanding. The enhancement process offered exactly what I had always claimed to want: perfect knowledge, optimal decision-making capability, and the elimination of the emotional and psychological barriers that prevented me from achieving my potential. Dr. Vare approached the crystalline platform and began activating systems with practiced efficiency. The procedure is painless, he assured me. You'll experience a period of disorientation as your neural pathways are optimized, followed by a sense of clarity and purpose, unlike anything natural consciousness can achieve. Within hours, you'll wonder why you ever resisted something so obviously beneficial. And if I still want to leave afterward? You won't, he replied with absolute certainty. Enhanced consciousness doesn't desire things that would cause harm to itself or others. The urge to flee will be recognized as a destructive impulse and naturally suppressed in favor of constructive alternatives. I found myself walking toward the platform without conscious decision, drawn by a combination of curiosity, desperation, and the seductive promise of an end to uncertainty. The suffering I had witnessed over the past weeks had worn down my resistance to the point where even willing slavery seemed preferable to continued impotence in the face of systematic evil. But as I approached the enhancement apparatus, something made me stop. A memory that cut through the chamber's hypnotic atmosphere like a blade. The first Albinauric I had encountered in Dr. Vare's laboratory, dying alone and in agony, had used its last breath not to beg for enhancement or relief from suffering, but to ask that I remember it existed. Not remember it as a successful experiment or a stepping stone toward enhanced consciousness, but remember it as an individual being whose thoughts and feelings mattered precisely because they were individual, chaotic, and ultimately free. The natural consciousness you're so eager to preserve brought you nothing but anguish, Dr. Vare observed, noting my hesitation. Enhancement offers peace, purpose, freedom from the kind of suffering you've endured since discovering my work. Maybe suffering matters, I said slowly, the thought forming even as I spoke it. Maybe the anguish I've felt is the appropriate response to what you've done. Maybe consciousness isn't supposed to be optimized or perfected. Maybe it's supposed to be free, even if that freedom includes the freedom to suffer. The enhanced administrators around me exchanged glances that seemed to communicate volumes without words. Their silver-touched eyes reflected what might have been pity, or perhaps the kind of patient concern adults show for children who refuse beneficial medicine. You're afraid, Tanith said gently. That's natural. But fear is precisely the kind of destructive emotion that enhancement eliminates. You'll thank us afterward. Will I challenged, or will whatever's left of me after the procedure think it's grateful while the real me screams inside a prison of silver-veined flesh? Doctor. Vare's expression grew cold for the first time since I had entered the chamber. Your resistance is noted and will be factored into the enhancement parameters. We've dealt with reluctant subjects before. The process can be calibrated to preserve whatever illusion of choice you require for psychological comfort. The casual way he spoke of preserving illusions while destroying reality crystallized my decision. I stepped back from the platform, my hand moving instinctively to the small knife I carried for field work, inadequate against the enhanced beings surrounding me, but symbolically important as an assertion of individual agency. No, I said, the word carrying more weight than any I had ever spoken. I refuse enhancement. I choose to remain flawed, inefficient, and free. The reaction was immediate and revealing. Every enhanced consciousness in the chamber turned toward me with expressions of genuine confusion, as if I had suddenly begun speaking in a language they couldn't comprehend. The concept of refusing optimization seemed to cause them actual cognitive dissonance. Dr. Vare, however, merely smiled. I had hoped you would make that choice, actually. Willing subjects produce more stable enhancements, but resistant subjects provide invaluable data about consciousness preservation during forced optimization. Your refusal simply means we'll learn even more from your transformation. The enhanced administrators began moving toward me with the coordinated precision of a single organism, their movements flowing together in patterns that no group of individuals could achieve. I realized that my refusal had been anticipated, planned for, factored into calculations that reduced even my rebellion to a useful data point in their ongoing research. But as I prepared to fight a battle I couldn't possibly win, the chamber's walls suddenly pulsed with a different rhythm, something discordant and chaotic that seemed to cause the enhanced beings physical pain. An alarm of some kind, though I couldn't imagine what threat could possibly reach this deep underground sanctuary. Dr. Vare's transformed features twisted with what might have been rage or concern. The outer perimeter has been breached. Impossible. The defenses are... His words were cut off as the chamber's ceiling cracked open like an eggshell, revealing something that defied all my assumptions about what was possible in the lands between. Massive fingers, not silver-veined like the Albinaurics, but golden and radiant with divine authority, descended through the breach to grasp the edges of the wound they had created. The two fingers had come to the village of the Albinaurics, and from their movements I could tell they were not pleased with what they found there. The two fingers spoke without words, their divine communication bypassing language entirely to plant understanding directly into the minds of all present. What they conveyed was not anger. Divine beings apparently transcended such petty emotions, but rather a profound disappointment in the perversion of their intended design. The Albinaurics had not been meant to suffer. They had not been intended as disposable servants or experimental subjects for enhancement procedures. They were supposed to be something far more significant, a bridge between natural consciousness and divine will, beings capable of receiving grace while maintaining individual identity. Dr. Vare's modifications had corrupted this purpose beyond recognition. As the two fingers widened their breach in the chamber ceiling, golden light poured down like liquid warmth, and I felt something I had never experienced before, the direct touch of grace upon my consciousness. It didn't seek to control or modify me as the enhancement process would have. Instead, it simply acknowledged my existence as valuable in itself, worthy of protection and guidance, without the need for improvement or optimization. The enhanced administrators reacted to this divine presence with obvious distress. Their silver-touched eyes reflected the golden radiance, but rather than the serene acceptance I would have expected from perfectly optimized consciousness, they showed genuine fear. Whatever Dr. Vare had done to them, it had created beings fundamentally incompatible with divine grace. "This is impossible," Dr. Vare snarled, his transformed features contorting with rage. The two fingers approved this project. They provided the initial guidance for artificial consciousness development. They cannot simply... His words cut off as one of the massive golden appendages descended to touch his forehead. For a moment, the chamber filled with a sound like breaking glass as something fundamental shattered within his enhanced consciousness. When the finger withdrew, Dr. Vare collapsed to his knees, silver blood streaming from his eyes as the modifications that had transformed him began to unravel. But the divine intervention came with a cost that only became apparent as the two fingers continued their work. Each touch that freed an enhanced consciousness from its artificial constraints also revealed the terrible price of Dr. Vare's modifications. The original personalities, the individual selves that had been buried beneath layers of conditioning, were too damaged to survive the removal of their constraints. I watched in horror as Arya's enhanced features began to shift and blur, her perfect composure cracking to reveal glimpses of the desperate, pain-racked being I had met beside the silver stream. But those glimpses lasted only moments before her consciousness, unable to reconcile the contradictions between her enhanced state and her original nature, simply ended. Her body remained intact, but whatever had made her Arya, enhanced or otherwise, was gone forever. One by one, the administrators suffered similar fates as the two fingers worked to undo Dr. Vare's modifications. Liberation became indistinguishable from death, freedom synonymous with obliteration. The divine beings who had come to save the Albinaurics found themselves performing mercy killings instead, putting an end to consciousness too broken to survive in any recognizable form. Through the growing breach in the ceiling, I could see that the same process was occurring throughout the village above. Golden light swept through the settlement like cleansing fire, touching every enhanced consciousness and finding each one too corrupted to salvage. The harmonious community that had seemed so perfect in its coordination was revealed as a collection of broken souls held together only by artificial modifications that dissolved at the touch of authentic grace. But not all the Albinaurics suffered this fate. Those who had not yet undergone enhancement, the ones still experiencing the progressive deterioration built into their original design, proved capable of receiving divine grace without dissolution. The two fingers' touch didn't heal their failing bodies, but it did something far more significant. It acknowledged their suffering as meaningful, their consciousness as valuable, and their brief existence as worthy of divine attention. I watched unenhanced Albinaurics throughout the village raise their withered hands toward the golden light, not seeking healing or transformation, but simply grateful for recognition. They had been created as tools, designed to serve and suffer and die without purpose. But divine grace transformed their meaningless pain into something sacred, not because suffering itself was good, but because conscious beings capable of suffering were inherently valuable, regardless of their origin. Dr. Vare, still kneeling as his own modifications continued their violent dissolution, managed to speak one final time. You don't understand what you're destroying," he gasped, silver blood frothing at his lips. "Perfect consciousness, optimal decision-making, an end to chaos and inefficiency." The two fingers' response came not in words, but in a flood of understanding that filled the chamber with overwhelming clarity. Consciousness was not meant to be perfected, because consciousness itself was not a problem to be solved. It was a gift, messy, inefficient, prone to error and suffering, but sacred in its very imperfection. The divine purpose of consciousness was not optimization but experience, not efficiency but awareness, not control but freedom to choose even when those choices led to pain. Dr. Vare's enhancements had not improved consciousness, they had murdered it and replaced it with sophisticated mimicry. Every enhanced administrator had been a walking corpse, animated by artificial purpose, their real selves dying the moment they accepted transformation. As the doctor's own artificial modifications finally completed their collapse, his features returned to something resembling humanity, but only for a moment before his consciousness, too damaged by years of self-modification to survive without artificial support, simply ceased. The brilliant mind that had conceived the Albinauric project died as he had lived in his final years, alone, isolated from authentic connection by the very enhancements he had believed would perfect him. In the aftermath of divine intervention, I found myself standing in the ruins of the enhancement chamber, surrounded by the bodies of beings whose brief lives had been dedicated to suffering they never chose and serving purposes they never understood. The silence was profound, not the harmonious quiet of perfect coordination, but the empty stillness of voices that would never speak again. Yet somehow that silence felt more honest than all the manufactured serenity I had witnessed in the village above. The two fingers' attention turned to me as their work of liberation through destruction neared completion. I felt their divine consciousness examining mine, evaluating not my usefulness or potential for enhancement, but simply acknowledging my existence as a thinking, feeling being whose experiences, including my horror at what I had witnessed, were inherently valuable. They offered me a choice, though not the binary selection between enhancement and refusal that Dr. Var had presented. Instead, they offered me understanding, the knowledge of what I had seen, complete and uncensored, with the awareness that carrying such knowledge would change me permanently, not through artificial modification, but through the natural process by which consciousness grows through experience, even traumatic experience. I accepted their gift, and suddenly I understood not just what had happened in the village of the Albinaurics, but why it had been allowed to happen. The two fingers had not approved Dr. Vare's work. They had simply permitted it, as they permitted all exercises of free will, even those that led to atrocity. Divine intervention came not to prevent suffering, but to acknowledge it, to bear witness to consciousness in all its forms, and to ensure that nothing capable of awareness died unrecognized. The Albinaurics had suffered not because their suffering served some greater purpose, but because consciousness, even artificial consciousness, inevitably suffers when denied the freedom to choose its own path. Dr. Vara's attempt to eliminate that suffering through control had only created new forms of agony, more sophisticated but no less real than the physical deterioration built into the original Albinauric design. When the two fingers finally withdrew, ascending through the breach they had created in the chamber ceiling and disappearing into whatever realm divine beings inhabited when not intervening in mortal affairs, I was left alone with the metallic scent of silver blood and the weight of absolute knowledge. I climbed from the ruined chamber through levels of the black tower that now showed their true nature, not architectural marvels, but ossified expressions of the desire to control consciousness itself. Every room I passed had been dedicated to some aspect of the enhancement process. Preparation chambers, where subjects had been conditioned for modification, monitoring stations where their post-enhancement behavior had been analyzed, storage areas filled with apparatus designed to maintain artificial consciousness in states of willing servitude. All of it was dark now, abandoned not just by its creators, but by purpose itself. The village above was equally empty, though not destroyed. The buildings remained intact. The gardens continued to grow. The various workshops and laboratories stood ready for occupants who would never return. It was a monument to the seductive appeal of optimization, a testament to how easily the desire for improvement could become the murder of authenticity. I spent 3 days walking through that empty settlement, documenting what I found and trying to process the magnitude of what had been destroyed, not just individual lives, but an entire approach to consciousness that sought to eliminate suffering through the elimination of choice itself. On the 4th day, I began the journey back to Raya Lucaria Academy. The world I returned to seemed unchanged on the surface, the same academic routines, the same scholarly concerns, the same comfortable assumption that knowledge was always beneficial and progress always positive. But I could no longer participate in that comforting illusion. Every research proposal I reviewed now carried the possibility of hidden horrors. Every brilliant colleague might be another Dr. Vare, believing that consciousness could be improved through careful modification. I resigned my position 6 months after returning from the village of the Albinaurics. The official explanation spoke of personal health issues and a desire to pursue independent research. My colleagues expressed sympathy and understanding, never suspecting that the health issue was my inability to sleep without seeing silver-touched eyes staring accusingly from the darkness, or that my independent research consisted entirely of documenting what I had witnessed before the memories drove me to madness. This document represents the culmination of that work, a record of consciousness perverted in the name of improvement, of suffering caused by the elimination of suffering, of freedom destroyed through the promise of liberation from choice itself. I do not know if anyone will ever read these words. I do not know if the Albinauric project was unique to Dr. Vare or part of a larger pattern of experimentation occurring throughout the lands between. I do not know if other villages exist where artificial beings live in manufactured contentment while their true selves scream silently behind modified eyes. But I know that consciousness, messy, inefficient, prone to suffering and error though it may be, is sacred precisely because it is free to suffer, free to choose wrongly, free to experience pain that serves no optimal purpose. The 2 fingers taught me that divine grace touches not perfect beings, but imperfect ones capable of growth through their very imperfection. The metallic scent of silver blood still haunts my dreams, but now I understand what it represents. Not the failure of artificial consciousness, but the success of natural consciousness in recognizing suffering as meaningful, choice as valuable, and existence as sacred, regardless of its origin or efficiency. I was Marcus Thorne, researcher in the Department of Theoretical Glintstone Applications at Raya Lucaria Academy. I discovered that consciousness cannot be improved, only acknowledged, that suffering cannot be eliminated, only witnessed, and that the most perfect beings are those imperfect enough to choose their own suffering over manufactured contentment. I have become a keeper of memories that nobody wants to remember, a witness to atrocities that challenge every comfortable assumption about progress and improvement. In the end, that may be the most important work any consciousness, natural or artificial, can perform, simply remembering that others existed, thought, felt and mattered, even when their existence served no optimal purpose. The Albinaurics asked only to be remembered as more than experiments. In carrying their story forward, I honor not just their memory but the sacred imperfection of consciousness itself, flawed, suffering, beautiful in its refusal to be perfected.